Oh, wow. In such an exciting and mind-bending way, this episode shows the reality of the saying, if you think you understand quantum physics, you don't. Just when we thought we were getting a handle on the complexity of this show, this episode truly burnt that hope to the ground twice over. The episode starts right where we left off, with Alice looking out the window of her cabin and seeing Joe get out of the blue car and put on her shoes to check on what she saw. As she opens the door, you can see that the painting facing the door is the wounded angel being carried by two people. Also, notice the color of the door is red. However, when she goes outside, there's no one there. Just as she goes outside, we see a time distortion where everything slows down, then starts back up again. Then, just like that, Alice's mom is not there, but she can still hear footprints in the snow and makes a desperate plea for Mama that Red Joe hears with Blue Alice in the back seat. When Alice leaves the cabin, you can see that she has an almost green-colored light with her. As Alice starts to run towards the lake to the other cabin, we see how Red Joe in Blue Reality can hear the footsteps, but not see Red Alice. Alice yells, "Mama, I saw you," then she runs off. We hear Mama again right before cutting to the intro. So much to process even though we're only 2 minutes in. Which of the Joe and Alice combos were there? To break that down, let's see what happens next compared to previous episodes. After the intro, we pick up where episode 5 leaves off with Red Joe and Blue Alice listening to the ghost tapes, and Joe has a cut on her left cheek. They play the tape again and you can hear Joe and Alice speaking Swedish. The MMOD alarm goes off and Paul yells Joe just before they shut it off. Alice finally tells Joe that she doesn't speak Swedish but understands a little and that they were talking about the cow before the accident. Joe tells Alice a bit about quantum physics and how it means that one thing can exist in multiple places at the same time. But before we go to the next scene, we need to ground ourselves a bit on who's who in this scene. There have been clues dropped before, but this scene really ties together enough to realize that there's more than one Red Joe Blue Alice combination. There's a Red Joe from 2021 and a Red Joe from 2023. In episode 5, on the way to the cabin, Red Joe is with Blue Alice driving at night and does have a cut on her cheek. When they listen to the ghost tapes, Red Alice and Red Joe are recorded having a conversation about dreaming of Earth or space. This Red Joe and Alice is in the timeline where the ISS accident was in October 14, 2021. In the beginning of episode 1, Red Joe is with Blue Alice on the way to the cabin and does not have a cut on her cheek. There was an emergency vehicle that passed them just after Alice asked, "When's Daddy coming?" And when they get to the cabin, there's no power. The black changeling painting is facing the door. Alice listens to a story from her mom on the iPad called The Little Rocket Girl and does not listen to the ghost tapes. I believe this Red Joe Alice combination is in the timeline where the ISS accident was in 2023 instead of 2021, because we followed the other Joe through 2021. Just as Joe says that one thing could exist in multiple places, we get a glimpse of Red Alice walking in the snow, but which one? I think this one is 2023 Alice because she's the same Alice over here, who's the same Alice as in the episode 6 ending, and episode 6 is from 2023. Back to playing more ghost tapes, they play one labeled October 15, 2021, and Joe says that's the day after the accident, which confirms that they're in 2021. The tape is of Paul being concerned about bringing Joe's dead body back. Did they record a version of Paul from 2023 in 2021, or is this a recording of Paul in 2021? Joe panics over hearing the tapes, shuts it off before we can hear anymore, and tries to pretend that it didn't happen. Alice asks, "Am I the same to you?" And you can see these painful gears in Joe's head turn as she realizes just how badly her reality is broken. "Am I your Alice?" Joe knows she can't lie to her and tells her the truth. It doesn't feel that way and tells her, "We just need to work it out." With 2021 Red Joe Blue Alice coming to terms of what's happening, Magnus, Frederick, and Henry are in a van being escorted by emergency vehicles up to the cabin. Henry tells Magnus that Irina is on the way as well because she's the one who will take care of your wife. When Magnus asks why Henry's even there, he tells him because this has happened to him as well. After this scene, the mind-bending reality starts to kick in. We can go back to the cabin with Joe putting the cow in the shed, closing the door, and we see it light up a bit and hum a bit louder. Just as Joe is walking back into the cabin, she hears Red Alice yelling "Mama," and Joe runs back inside and sees that Blue Alice is sleeping in her bed. As we see Joe leave the cabin, and there's a few details to note. The tape recorder is on the table, their dinner plate is still there, and has the black changeling in front of the door, so this looks like the blue 2021 cabin. Joe grabs a lantern and goes out over the lake to look for Alice, and at the same time, Red Alice is running through the snow and falls flat on her face. As she gets up, she sees a dark cabin with a dimly lit bulb with icicles in it. This cabin looks like hers, but it's much older and run down looking. She grabs the key from the top, just like hers, and with the help of her flashlight, you can see that the door's red paint has completely come off. When walking in, she notices a cat on a chair and it walks off, as she stops and takes a long pause to look at the black changeling painting. Since she paused to look at it, so did I. It does look a bit out of place because it looks a bit newer and more colorful than previously seen. The cabin's insides are also covered in snow from the broken windows, letting the weather in. Alice goes upstairs and approaches an old cupboard, puts her necklace around the hatch, climbs in, and the wind shuts the door and locks her in. We see Joe turning around and heading to the cabin. She hears Alice screaming for help in. Next thing we see, Joe is pulling Alice out of the cupboard. Now, which Joe-Alice combination is this? It looks like this is the Alice that she pulled out of the cupboard at the end of episode 1, but in episode 1, you can see that the door is not as faded as much. Still faded, and when she goes in, there's a dead cat on the ground. Even the cats look different. It looks like the same place, but they look several years apart. Alice also doesn't look frostbitten in episode 7 as she does in episode 1. Joe takes Alice out of the cabin and carries her back to the blue reality cabin. While she's carrying Alice, Joe asks, "Why did you hide in the cupboard?" In episode 2, Joe asks, "How did you get there?" So we can tell this is a different set of Joe and Alice. Joe draws Alice a bath, realizes that Alice smells like her Alice, then goes to boil some more water. In the mirror, we can see the wounded angel painting is facing the bathroom. Joe realizes that there are now 2 Alices in the cabin, gets a headache, blue Alice approaches, says mummy, then red Alice disappears back to her reality, 30-ish seconds after her headache. Alice reappears in the red cabin, yells for her mama, and wakes up Magnus. As Magnus gets up, you can see in the background that this cabin has the black changeling facing the bathroom instead of the wounded angel. Alice tells her dad that she saw her mama, and of course, Magnus continues to deny it. The more he tries to deny her, the more frustrated Alice gets. She tells Magnus, "I felt it, I felt her, I smelt her." And even with that, Magnus just keeps denying her. Back to Joe. Joe is frantically searching the cabin and yelling in Swedish and has a frantic conversation with Alice. It's weird because at this point, we just saw Red Joe and Alice have a heart-to-heart about not being the same, but now Joe is all panicky and acting like she forgot. Alice, being confused, says, "I'm sorry, can we go back to how we were?" But Joe just looks at her and tells her to get dressed, and Joe grabs the cowl and then says she was hiding in the cupboard, she'll freeze to death. This took a bit of bending to figure out, but here's what I think happened. Joe has a headache, Alice goes back to her cabin. 2 minutes later, from this perspective, Joe from the end of episode 2 jumps from the helicopter to this point. In the episode 2 ending, we see Joe jump right to the point where she looks at Alice and desperately asks Alice, "Where is she?" then frantically speaks Swedish. This is why the conversation got so weird. From here, we see this combination of 2021 Joe from the episode 2 helicopter move and Alice go to look for 2021 Red Alice in the cupboard at the cabin across the lake. Wow. Magnus, Henry, and Frederick arrive at the road to the cabin, but Magnus is told by the emergency crew that the road is blocked. Determined, he says he's not going to wait and sets out on foot over the ice towards the cabin. Next, we see Joe and Alice walking in the snow while Alice is dropping beads on the ground. Alice stops and tells Joe that she doesn't think that there's another and that people can see things when they're upset, especially people who have been to space. Joe says that she doesn't want to hurt or upset her, but she doesn't think that she's her daughter. Alice says, "But if I'm not, who are you? What have you done to my mummy?" Joe says, "Let's find out together." But Alice panics, grabs the cowl, runs off, and then drops it while saying, "You're crazy," and runs away. We've already seen a different Joe and Blue Alice that have confronted this issue in the cabin with the tapes, so I think this is the other Joe-Alice combination. After Blue Alice runs away from Joe, we see the opposite happening in the 2023 Red cabin. Magnus is sleeping and Alice is getting dressed to go find her mama. As Alice is getting dressed, we catch a glimpse of Joe chasing after and calling for Alice right before Alice leaves the cabin. Magnus wakes up, calls for Alice, checks the tub, then quickly realizes that she ran off when he sees the front door swinging wide open. For people living in the cold, I would have expected them to be a bit more aware of shutting doors. Next, we see Alice walking in the snow and she notices a bead just like hers on the ground. She picks it up, inspects it, and then continues to follow them until she sees the cowl that the other Alice dropped after calling Joe crazy. Having no idea what this is, she inspects it before calling for her mama again. Then we see Blue Alice coming up to a cabin with a dimly lit streetlight without icicles on it. This is the same cabin we saw earlier, but looks like there's a slight time difference. At this point, I'm thinking that this is the same cabin, but 10 years earlier. She says, "Mommy, I think I found it. I found the other cabin," but when she turns around, Joe is not there. Alice walks into the cabin and it looks like it's been abandoned for a long time. She sees a dead cat on the ground and it looks like the same one Red Alice saw earlier, but looks like it's recently died. She turns to the painting facing the door and, to my surprise, it's not a black changeling or a wounded angel being carried on a stretcher. Instead, it's an angel kneeling in front of what looks like a fireplace. She wipes the dust off the painting, notices the changeling painting and tape recorder to the right, and then takes the recorder upstairs. When she gets upstairs, she notices that there's a beaded necklace hanging on the cupboard. Next, we see Red Alice walking up to the cabin with a dimly lit street light that has icicles, but we also see the light from Blue Alice in the cabin that does not have icicles. As Red Alice walks into the cabin, we can see that the cat is still alive. Blue Alice starts to use the tape recorder to send messages to the other Alice. Alice, can you hear this? Red Alice makes her way up to the cupboard, sees a necklace on the cupboard, and the tape recorder inside. She plays the tape and is surprised to hear the recording made by the other Alice. She gets in the cupboard and they start exchanging messages. After Red Alice gets in the cupboard, we see Joe walking up to a cabin with Joe's blue car parked out front and being very confused. Now we start to see both Joe and Magnus at about the same time doing the same things. Joe walks into the cabin and starts looking for Alice, and Magnus is frantically searching for his Alice. We see both Magnus and Joe hearing the conversation that the Alices are having in the cupboard. They both walk upstairs to the cupboard. We can tell that Magnus's cabin has power because he turns the light switch on. Joe's cabin doesn't because she's carrying a lantern. Both Joe and Magnus are seen opening the cupboard at the same time and seeing the tape recorder play. I think this ability to play the recorder, even though they're not there, will have a factor into how Soyuz 1 was able to detach after the bolt failure. After a minute using the tape recorder, both Alices agree to look at a mirror and they see each other. And they're amazed at that. Magnus panics, goes outside, and calls the police to help search for his daughter. At the same time, Joe is also panicking, sets the lantern down next to a lamp. Also in the background, you can see the wounded angel painting to the right of the door. Joe runs to the car with the tape recorder, drives off, and then we see the lantern next to the lamp fall and the cabin catches fire. The Alices continue their conversation and realize we really are the same. Red Alice says her mama came and got her out of the cupboard, and at the same time we see Joe driving and listening to the tape. When Blue Alice asks if Red Alice's mom is staying there with her, she tearfully says she can't, she's dead. And Joe slams the brakes. Also kind of impressed with the braking ability of this car in the snow. Joe notices in her rearview mirror that there's a fire in the cabin that she just left and does a full U-turn to drive back. While Joe is driving back, Red Alice explains that her mom died in space and is still up there. Red Alice confirms that her mama's car is red and that they speak Swedish. This clicks for Blue Alice. So when Red Alice asks, "Is your mom dead too?" she tearfully says, "I think your mama is alive and it's my mummy who died." I was already feeling the heartstrings at the moment, but when Red Alice asked, "Can I have her back?" that really hit some heartstrings. Wow. With that heartbreaking cry to have her mama back, we're taken back to the cabin that is now starting to catch on fire. This part isn't really shown very well in the show, but it looks like that the fire that Joe saw burning from the car was much bigger than the fire we see starting to catch in the cabin. Almost like there's about a 2 to 3 minute difference. You can see that the flames in the cabin are not up to the ceiling, but in the mirror, they've engulfed the whole front porch and windows. As Joe heads back to the cabin, we move to see Blue, Magnus, and Henry from 2021 having a conversation about what happened to Henry during Apollo 18. We finally get confirmation from Henry that when this Henry was descending, he saw that his crew looked dead, blacked out, and then when he came to, they were all miraculously okay. He says he got better by taking the pills and throwing himself into his work. This is the same but opposite story that cruise ship Bud Caldera told Mr. Rogers right before throwing him off the ship. "I fixed it. I fixed everything on Apollo 18. Those guys were alive, and then suddenly they were dead." To note, the act of Bud throwing Mr. Rogers off the cruise ship was on the 17th of October 2021, so that puts both of the Henrys from 2021. After their conversation, the search party heads out to the lake to search for Alice. As they're searching, we see Henry start to experience headaches and flashbacks of leaving the note in the mirror, being woken up in his room in Germany, and then seeing the Cal humming and glowing in front of him. This is the Cal that Blue Alice picked up and dropped after calling Joe crazy. As Henry starts to move towards the Cal, we switch back to Joe driving back to the cabin on fire. When she pulls up to the cabin, we can see that the fire is still not as big as it was in the rearview mirror. When she pulls up to the house, we can see the same bright orange fire in the windshield. This looks so much more like the fire we saw in the rearview mirror. Joe gets out of the car and now we see the same intense fire as in the windshield. Something catches my eye about this fire and it looks a lot like orange glowing angels. Joe runs into the burning cabin and then boom! No fire. What? Instead, she's in another version of the cabin. She looks around confused, just like all of us. Then she looks at the painting facing the door, and we see in the reflection the painting of the angel kneeling in front of the fireplace from earlier. Confused, she stops and takes a good look at it while reaching out to touch it. She sees the same dead kitty that we saw earlier, but there's a second cat alive, and it looks like a few weeks or months have passed. Joe turns to the right, and we see the changeling painting with a fire reflection, but this fire doesn't seem to be burning as intensely as the fire in the other reflection. This makes it look like that they're are two fires. Joe walks upstairs, then Blue Alice in the cupboard hears footsteps and starts banging on the door. When Joe opens the door, she sees Blue Alice. The Blue Alice who just realized about 10 minutes ago that her mom had died. Alice says, "Just me, not the one who speaks Swedish." They realize that Red Alice can't hear Joe, so Blue Alice says, "You have to speak through me." As Joe and the Alices are just about to have a conversation, we move back to Henry tracking through the snow towards the cow and having flashbacks about previous encounters with Bud. As he picks up the cow, you can hear it humming and see it glowing. Henry looks mighty pleased with himself as he picks it up and hears a voice saying, "Boy, am I gonna things up." Just as Henry secures the cowl, we move to Magnus and the search party looking for Alice, led by the Blue Magnus who just found out about Henry. Then we switch over to Red Magnus who just called the police and is out on the lake looking for Alice by himself. While everyone is out searching for the Alices, we go back to the cabin where Joe and the Alices are having a conversation where they speak through the Blue Alice, and Joe and Alice exchange, "I love you and I miss you." But Joe has to tell Red Alice that she doesn't know how to get back and will have to work it out. During their conversation, we see the fire burn the changeling painting in the wall behind. Smoke quickly starts to roll upstairs right before we cut back to Henry, and now he's still seeing more and more flashbacks from Bud. We hear Paul's voice and see a scene where Paul is arriving at Bud's apartment looking for answers. Just as he's hearing this, he sees a fire in the distance. He drops the cowl and makes his way as fast as he can. As he's heading there, we see the changeling painting continuing to burn and see the smoke start to fill upstairs. Red Alice says, "Mama, I'm cold," and you can see that she's starting to go hypothermic. Alice cries out one last time, "Mama," before Joe starts to see the smoke that is making Blue Alice cough, and we can start to hear the fire in the background. All of a sudden, there's fire everywhere, and the mirror cracks. This is also very similar to what happened on the ISS. In episode 6, when Joe was on the ISS, she places the iPad on the cupola window. And then a few moments later, it cracks and there's a hole in it before Joe hits it. Did her beads explode through the mirror because the hole in the ISS cupola and the Apollo 18 depressed? Who knows? Joe grabs Blue Alice and carries her through the fire, similar to how she had Ilya hold on to her while she saved him from a fire. As Joe runs through the fire, we see the tape recorder begin to melt. As Joe is pulling Alice out of the fire, Henry approaches the burning cabin with Joe's blue car parked out front and continues to experience the encounter Bud has with Paul looking for answers. Just as Henry reaches the door, we hear the gunshot. Then we see Henry standing in the fiery doorway, looking like he's pointing a gun and looking very confused. Henry just swapped with Bud. Henry, now in Bud's apartment, is shocked to see where he is and that he's holding a gun. Bud, now in Henry's spot, is just as shocked. Joe calls out to Henry, passes him Blue Alice, and then goes back into the fire to save her daughter. Jump back to Bud's apartment, Henry sees Paul laying on the ground, bleeding out from a gunshot to the stomach. Henry calls out to him, Paul, it's me, Henry," and pleads with him to stay alive. Henry picks up Bud's phone and the date is November 8th, but it doesn't show the year, and Henry calls an ambulance. At the same time, Bud is about to do the opposite by dropping off Blue Alice and walking away. At first, this looks like we picked up where episode 6 left off, with Paul being shot but on the floor of the apartment. There's recent BirdieCon flyers on the box, and that was in 2021. The time on Bud's phone is 2106, and the address is 60556. In episode 6, we know that Paul is in 2023 because the recording from the ISS right before the accident shows 10/14/2023. And when Paul pulls up to Bud's apartment, Paul's navigation says 60566, and the time is 22:54. Just before he hangs up the phone, he gives his name, but he gets angry and says, Bud Caldera. I think this means a swap just happened again because Henry doesn't act that way. Henry drops Blue Alice off in the snow and says, "Who the fuck are you, kid?" and complains about just being in his underwear, then walks off yelling for help. After Henry/Bud drops Alice in the snow, we see Joe searching through the burning home with embers and an orange glow everywhere. We don't see much else from the fire inside. The next thing we know, Joe is outside the burning cabin witnessing it go up in flames. She sees Blue Alice lay on the ground where Bud/Henry left her and starts giving her CPR. Just as she's trying to save her, Red Alice appears and says, "I made you one of these," and holds up a necklace. Joe looks over, but she knows she has to save Blue Alice regardless of how badly she wants to be with her Alice. She tells her, "I have to save her," and continues CPR. Alice says, "I can't feel her anymore, I think she's dead," but Joe doesn't give up. In the background, we can hear Magnus calling for Alice. Joe tells her daughter, go to him, while sobbing. I think she knows this means they're parting ways again. Magnus's voice starts to get louder and more clear while Alice stands there looking at her and asks, "Am I your Alice?" And Joe tells her yes, but she needs to go to Papa. Magnus looks towards Alice and Joe and whispers, "Joe?" Yes! He did see Joe. As Blue Magnus and the search crew descend on Joe, you can see Henry/Bud collapse on the ground. Is he dead? As Red Alice watches the search crew come for Joe, her dad starts to appear in the background and it's just him, no search party. Joe brings Blue Alice back to life just as Blue Magnus arrives. Magnus is pissed and demands, "What the f did you do?" But Joe doesn't have a response. She tries to go find her Alice again, but the police restrain her. Blue Alice is taken away on a stretcher and hooked up to O2, and the fire continues to blaze. Red Alice is taken back to the cabin by her dad and told never to do that again. And Alice asks Magnus, "Did you see her?" But he says, "I don't know," and then pans to the wounded angel painting. Wow, through the looking glass indeed. In the final moments of the episode, we see Alice sleeping in a hospital bed. Then it cuts to darkness and shows her walking through the hospital. There's a faint whisper of the Irina recordings, then we hear a woman speaking to Alice in Russian, "Do you want to see your mama?" And then, oh my god, it's the dead cosmonaut. She really does look creepy, but she has a kind voice and sounds genuine. The Valia says, "Come with me, I'll take you to your mama, she's not far." I double-checked with an English to Russian translator and can confirm that she spoke Russian. The last words we hear before Alice wakes up, "Come away, my child." When Alice wakes up, she asks her dad about where Joe is. Magnus tells her she went with Irina to get help, and Alice asks the cosmonaut, and when Magnus confirms, she says, "We have to get her back." And there you have it, folks, as we once again continue to seep into the madness of Constellation. Some of our theories, I think, are spot on, and others we're still cooking up, but anyway, be sure to leave your Constellation theories down in the comments, and until next time, thanks for watching.